Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on an introduction to Part 107 and preparing for the exam. Before we begin, please be sure to mute yourself just to eliminate any background noise during the webinar. Also, if you think of any questions during the webinar, please feel free to submit them in the chat section on your screen and we will answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. So I'm sure many of you already know that the drone industry is just taking off and is expected to continue growing in years to come, which means drone pilots are going to become even more in demand. For new and existing pilots, Part 107 is obviously a huge component. It's important to know exactly what Part 107 is and how to prepare for this FAA exam. So today we will be providing a comprehensive overview of Part 107, how to prepare for the exam, as well as a few sample test questions so everyone leaves with a good sense of what the exam will be like. So today's speaker, who will be covering this topic, is Colin Romberger. Colin is both a private pilot and advanced ground instructor and holds a master's degree in UAS design and operations from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He holds multiple FAA airman certificates for manned aircraft operations, and he currently owns and operates a drone services company in Pennsylvania with a focus on mapping and inspections. So we have a lot of information to share in today's webinar, so I will pass it over to Colin and we'll get started.
Great, thanks, Alicia. Appreciate it. And again, welcome everyone. Looking forward to talking to you today and answering some of your questions about Part 107 and in the simplest terms, how do we operate a drone or an unmanned aircraft for commercial or official purposes within the United States, within our national airspace system. So when people ask us, what is Part 107? You hear all this talk, about Part 107 and Part 107 certificates and how this has something to do with drones. Basically, Part 107 just refers to the specific set of regulations that the FAA put out in 2016 as the first step, we'll say, or the first set of regulations that allow folks to use small unmanned aircraft or drones for commercial purposes within our national airspace system. If this is the first step in what is expected to be an ongoing integration process. The FAA actually first started talking about integrating unmanned aircraft of multiple different sizes and all scopes of operations back in 2012. And basically in 2012, when they put out that document, they said that by 2025, basically they wanted to have full integration of our airspace for all types of unmanned aircraft, serving all types of purposes and flying basically potentially anywhere within our skies. So this is the first step, and it gives us framework to basically use what the FAA has designated as a small unmanned aircraft for some basic purposes that would help out a lot of commercial and official organizations. One of the key parts of the framework that Part 107 provides is it created a new type of pilot certificate. It created what the FAA is calling a remote pilot certificate with a small UAS rating, and that's the actual credential that someone has to earn, someone has to be able to receive that in order to operate a small unmanned aircraft for these commercial purposes here in the United States. The remote pilot certificate, some people will call this a drone license. Some people talk about the Part 107 exam or the remote pilot exam, aeronautical knowledge tests. All of it refers to basically the same thing. You must take a FAA knowledge test or a knowledge exam to earn that remote pilot certificate. Once you pass that exam, there is no practical requirement at this point to be able to fly, so you don't have to demonstrate to anyone any sort of hands-on skills with the aircraft, at least not to any FAA officials, although a lot of companies have adopted internal policies because their insurance companies, things like that, want to see that their operators have been properly trained to fly the aircraft as well. But from the FAA standpoint, once you pass that knowledge test, you will receive that certificate, and you can begin conducting those flights under the Part 107 regulations. There is a requirement, just like there is for every pilot certificate that the FAA issues for all types of aircraft, that to keep the certificate current, you must pass what's called a biannual flight review every 2 years. So because the test that is given to get the remote pilot certificate is only a knowledge test, there is no practical component. That's what you're going to have to do every 2 years. It's basically a knowledge test of sorts to be able to keep that credential current. It will never, the certificate itself that you receive initially doesn't have an expiration date, but unless you keep up with those biannual review requirements, it will lose its currency. So moving on. So what do you need, who needs to take this exam to get this remote pilot certificate? So really, again, this only applies to individuals who intend to use an unmanned aircraft for work or some sort of official purpose, or commercial purpose. So recreational users, someone that just wants to go out and fly for fun in their backyard or local parks, take a drone on vacation with you to get some neat videos and photographs just for personal use of your travels. You do not need to take the exam to get a remote pilot certificate. The FAA basically allows drone operators of small drones to follow the same community-based guidelines that the model aircraft, the RC model aircraft community follows. And those are outlined in both two areas, really. Part 101 of the Federal Aviation Regulations refers to model aircraft, and then also Section 336 of the Federal Modernization and Reform Act. That's where they lay out those community-based guidelines for recreational users of drones or small unmanned aircraft. Part 61 pilots. So anyone that has a current FAA pilot certificate to fly manned aircraft, so a sport pilot, a private pilot, commercial pilot, those individuals do not have to take the full Part 107 knowledge test to get a Part 107 certificate as a remote pilot certificate. Basically, they can do an short online course with a few short questions in there, get a certificate as a result of that, submit that information through the FAA's IACRA website to process the application, and they would get the same remote pilot certificate that everyone else would have to take the full knowledge test to be able to get. For a Part 61 pilot, someone that has a private pilot certificate, things like that, that certificate does have to be current for them to be able to pursue that method. If their certificate has lapsed, they haven't completed the biannual requirements, something like that, then they still also would have to take the full knowledge test that new applicants or non-pilots would have to take. And finally, if you're under the age of 16, younger children under the age of 16, they are not eligible to earn a remote pilot certificate. 16 is the minimum age that the FAA says you need to be for them to issue you that certificate. Therefore, you wouldn't have to take that exam to fly until you reach that age, but you would only be able to fly drones, again, for fun, not for any sort of commercial purposes. All right, moving on. Some details about the exam itself. So most of our students, when they come back to us and they tell us, what their total amount of prep time was, getting ready to actually sit for the FAA exam, they tell us that including the time they spend with us, if they come to one of our in-person courses, that's an 8-hour day. So including that time, or if they're just studying on their own with our online resources, takes them between 15 and 20 hours, basically, of preparation time between reviewing the material that's going to be covered and also taking practice tests to make sure that they're going to be successful when they get out there the first time. And it is very important that they are successful the first time because, as you can see, it does cost $150 every time you go and take the test, and that is pass or fail. So if you fail, you have to wait 14 days, go back again, and then pay another $150. In order to register for the exam, there are lots of testing centers around the United States. The FAA has almost 700 of them, and you can actually go to the FAA's website, just faa.gov, and they have a little search bar there at the top. Just put in FAA Knowledge Test Centers, and the first result that'll pop up will be a PDF with a list of those centers broken down by state. Once you register and you go and you take the exam at the test centers, and just so that you know, the test centers are usually local flight schools. So if you have an airport nearby that has a flight school, you know, it may actually, if it's a larger flight school, it may be one of those test centers. So what happens after you go and you take the exam, you pass? What they're going to do, whenever you pass the exam that day, they're going to give you a report, a test report, and it's going to have your score on there, your passing score, hopefully, and also a reference number. And what you're going to do is you're going to take that piece of paper home, and you submit an application for your remote pilot certificate via the FAA's IACRA website, which stands for Integrated Airman Certification and Rating Application. So you'll go to IACRA, iacra.faa.gov. You'll create an account, and it will basically use that account information to populate an airman certificate application. You will input the reference number from your test score or your test report into that application, and then you'll submit everything and you'll wait. And about a week later, usually no longer than a week, typically it's only about 3 or 4 days, you're going to get an email from the FAA, and it's going to say, okay, here is now you can log back into your IACRA account, and there's going to be a temporary certificate there that you can print out. Once you print and sign that temporary certificate, in the eyes of the FAA, you are legal to start flying under those Part 107 regulations. And then within about 1 to 3 months, usually about, right about half of that time, about 45 to 60 days or so, you're going to receive a permanent card style, plastic credit card style certificate in the mail, and that will be your permanent remote pilot certificate. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So a lot of people ask us, as they're just getting started with this process of preparing, they know they're going to have to take this test. Either their companies have said, we're going to start integrating unmanned aircraft. We think they could help us out. Or maybe you're thinking, this looks like a great new business opportunity to get into, whatever the case might be. You're going to want to know up front, what types of topics am I going to have to learn about to be able to pass this test? So there are 10 different topics that the FAA has identified, and they're actually listed in the information under Part 107. If you look up that set of federal aviation regulations, it will tell you what those areas are. So the first area is the actual regulations themselves. We have to be familiar with it. For any exam that the FAA gives, they're going to test you on the actual regulations that define that certificate. So you'll have to know the Part 107 regulations inside and out. They're also going to spend a lot of time asking you questions related to airspace. So you're going to have to be able to look at FAA aeronautical charts, specifically sectional charts is what they call them, and determine based on the different classes of airspace that are depicted where we can fly and where we can't. So they're going to give you some locations, and you'll have to look at those charts and make a determination. Can I fly here or not? They're also going to want to make sure that you know about certain additional restrictions that can come up that may restrict flight. Things like temporary flight restrictions, special use airspace that's used for military operations that may be restricted or prohibited areas. Those are also things that they're going to be asking questions about. There are questions related to operations around airports and some that reference some radio communication information, mainly because when we fly close to small airports, the FAA wants us to understand, where we can expect to see small aircraft flying around those airports, so that we can make good choices and make sure we're not causing any interference. Aviation weather, being able to look at aviation weather reports and also make determinations on whether or not the weather conditions that are currently currently in place will allow us to fly based on the regulations. We do have to look for specific weather conditions to be able to fly under those Part 107 rules, or just, based on the capabilities of our aircraft, are we going to be able to make a go decision for flight and know that safety is not going to be compromised. Maintenance and pre-flight procedures. So what do we need to do to check our aircraft and make sure that it stays in an airworthy condition? What is the FAA's concerns there? Things called crew resource management and aeronautical decision making, which looks at things like risk assessments, using risk assessment matrices, identifying hazards and identifying hazardous attitudes. Also, crew briefings and crew communications, some discussion about that there as well. SUAS loading and performance, so some basic aerodynamic factors that would be involved in preparing an unmanned aircraft for flight. And finally, hazards to flight and emergency procedures, some references there as well. Okay, moving on. So looking at the actual regulations themselves, and again, as I mentioned, the regulations are going to play a big part in the test. The three really big heavy-hitting areas out of all those topics that we just looked at are the regulations themselves, questions that are going to reference the sectional charts, so those aeronautical charts, and also weather information. Those are really the ones that for most people seem to be the newest information, the stuff that they're not that used to seeing in other just study or other things that you may have done previously. It's the brand new stuff that you've never really looked at, and that is really where the FAA puts a lot of emphasis. So looking at the regulations, some basic ones that we're going to go through here and kind of paint a picture of what we can do and what we can't do at this stage in the game. First off, in terms of altitude, we are confined to relatively low altitudes in most cases, and the regulations tell us that a small unmanned aircraft can be flown from the surface or the ground up to 400 feet above ground level, or AGL as they say. Now that's the standard. However, if you are flying within a 400-foot radius of a structure, some sort of man-made structure, you can fly up to 400 feet above that structure's uppermost point, so long as you stay within that radius. So for inspection purposes of large structures, cell phone towers, radio towers, especially more of your FM and AM radio towers and things, you can very easily inspect the entirety of those structures, provided that they're located in our normal uncontrolled airspace, which most of the country would be. Moving on from altitude. So here is our question about airspace. So a small unmanned aircraft system pilot must have authorization to operate in Class B, C, D, or the lateral boundaries of a Class E surface area of airspace. So there are 6 classes of airspace within our National Airspace System. We have A, B, C, D, E, and G. And basically, if we're flying in B, C, D, or a surface area of Class E, we need to get a authorization to be able to do that. That authorization process is going through some modifications as we speak. It used to be somewhat of a process to get authorizations. It's becoming a bit easier, and actually a lot easier at the moment. But you do need to go through a special step. You can't just go out and fly if the area that you need to fly is in one of those controlled classes. The good news is that, like I said before, most of the country is in our uncontrolled Class G airspace from the ground up to at least 700 feet above the ground. So usually conducting our flights up to 400 feet is, for a lot of folks, is not a problem. Also, if the agency that is conducting the flight is operating with what's called a certificate of authorization, the terms of their COA will stipulate any applicable airspace restrictions and authorizations. So in this case, the term COA, or certificate of authorization, would refer to a public use certificate of authorization, and that is a specific document that public entities, so emergency services agencies, police departments, fire departments, also publicly funded schools and government agencies at the state, local, or federal level. They can basically apply for one of these public use certificates, which would allow them to do things beyond the scope, we'll say, of normal Part 107 regulations if they had a ongoing need to do that. So if they were to petition for this and were to be issued one of these public use certificates of authorization, their exact operating terms and where they can fly in terms of airspace would be stated in that document. All right, moving on to our next section, night operations. So the standard Part 107 regulations say that we cannot fly a small unmanned aircraft during nighttime periods unless we petition the FAA for a waiver of our Part 107 regulations to be able to do that. Night flight is actually one of the more common waivers that the FAA does issue, though. It's probably the most common, and it's very easy to get a waiver to be able to operate at night once you get that Part 107 certificate, if that's what your company or your plans are. Require that operation. Usually those waivers are issued within about 30 days, and the actual process of applying for them is fairly straightforward, although we do recommend that you do your research, do your due diligence. We also provide a service to help folks prepare and submit those requests. Also, the small unmanned aircraft must be equipped with an anti-collision lighting system for flights at night or during periods of what they call civil twilight. Civil twilight is basically the half hour before sunrise in the morning and the half hour after sunset in the evening. If we have anti-collision lights on our aircraft that make it visible for up to 3 statute miles, then we can fly during those periods without a night waiver. However, if we're outside of civil twilight, if we are in actual nighttime, we need that waiver, and we also need the anti-collision lighting. Also, if the agency is operating with a certificate of authorization, it is possible for night operations to be included as an approved activity. So again, once again, if a public agency requests a public use COA and that is issued, which it is usually about the preparation of that document usually takes the longest time for an agency, but the actual approval process, depending on the type of COA that they're looking for, that can take 4 to 6 months in and of itself. So it is more timely, but if they're eligible and they need to regularly operate outside of normal Part 107 regulations, it is there. And again, everything, all the specifics as far as what they can do and can't do are going to be specified in those terms, including potentially night operations. Okay, moving on. Visual line of sight. So this tells us in our Part 107 regulations that whenever we fly a small unmanned aircraft, it must always remain within visual line of sight of either the pilot in command, so whoever holds that remote pilot certificate, or a visual observer. So basically, bottom line is someone has to be able to see the aircraft from their position on the ground whenever it's in flight. Okay, there's some nuances to this that you'll learn more about in some of our other courses, but like we said, at this point, if we're flying under 107, everything does have to be we have to make sure that we can always acquire visual contact with that aircraft. Also, the pilot in command and visual observers must have an effective form of communication. So if we place individuals that are serving as visual observers around a large flight area so that we can keep track of that aircraft as it's flying around and performing its mission, those visual observers must have some sort of direct contact to the pilot in command. The FAA does not specify, what form of communication we use, only that it is effective, and that's good, because some of the early authorizations that the FAA issued for flights before we had formalized Part 107 regulations basically said that the only way we could talk to visual observers was just with direct verbal communication. So basically they had to be standing right next to us. We couldn't use any sort of electronic aids. Now the use of two-way radios is very common. Some people will use cell phones depending on where they're at and what they're doing. So we can extend our range a little bit and still have an effective form of communication. All right, moving on. So flight over people. So the Part 107 regulations tell us that we cannot fly a small unmanned aircraft directly over a group of people or members of the public unless they are under a covered structure capable of protecting them from a falling small unmanned aircraft, or if they are sitting in a stationary vehicle. If the vehicle is moving on a roadway, then we are not allowed to fly over those vehicles. So in this case, again, the FAA does not specify a standoff distance as far as how far away from these members of the public or moving vehicles on roadway the aircraft has to remain. So, it's not super restrictive. Usually we can do things like plan out our flight paths very specifically, use our payloads and our cameras to monitor for people or vehicles that may be crossing or may have the potential of crossing underneath us and avoiding those situations. So not too bad. But if we do need to hover directly over large public gatherings, things like that, then we would need to get a waiver to be able to do that. And again, agencies that have a approved certificate of authorization, one of those public use certificates of authorizations, they may receive authorization to be able to fly over members of the public, either for specific purposes, if they're responding to an emergency situation, or as the result of incidental flight over people. So basically, just on the nature of where they have to operate and what they need to do. Perhaps people may cross underneath them, unknowingly that there's an aircraft there. They could have the FAA's clearance for that to take place with those public use COAs. All right, moving on. Weather requirements. So I stated one of the reasons that we have to learn quite a bit about weather conditions is that the FAA, does expect us to be able to abide by certain weather minimums to be able to fly under the Part 107 regulations. So first off, we always have to have reported visibility of at least 3 statute miles from where our flight location is located to be able to fly. So basically, the clouds have to be high enough and the rain has to be either no rain or light enough that we can see up to 3 miles in any given direction. And that is something that they report on those aviation weather reports. Also, we have to make sure that our small unmanned aircraft remains clear of clouds. Specifically, we have to be 2,000 feet horizontal from any low-lying clouds that might be in an area, or 500 feet below any cloud that may be right overhead of our flight area. And again, they will include cloud height information in those aviation weather reports. So another reason why we have to learn to read those. Okay, moving on. Operating from a moving vehicle. So we are not allowed to fly a small unmanned aircraft from any other moving aircraft. That really doesn't come up all that often, but you can't sit in a hot air balloon or a helicopter and try and fly the drone, by looking out, basically. And they also tell us that the small unmanned aircraft may be operated from a moving vehicle, but only if the small unmanned aircraft is flown over a sparsely populated area and the driver of the vehicle has no other responsibilities other than driving, and basically you are also not transporting anyone else's property for compensation or hire. So at this point, Part 107 would not allow for straight deliveries in that regard if you're transporting someone else's property. So moving vehicle would apply to either a land-based moving vehicle like a car, truck, something like that, or a boat, a vessel on the water. Okay, moving on. Inspections for safe operations. So in terms of maintenance requirements right now, the FAA really doesn't go into a whole lot of specifics as far as requirements on certain annual inspection processes that need to be done, or different types of maintenance requirements for small unmanned aircraft. And really that's because by the time the FAA started to put these plans for integration together and really started paying attention to small unmanned aircraft and what folks had already been creating and starting to use, there was already such a wide variety of systems out there that they really haven't been able to get a full grasp on all that. Also, given the relative simplicity of the small unmanned aircraft systems and most of the small systems that folks are using today, really the FAA doesn't feel like it's something that they have to get in there and do a whole lot with at this level. Basically, what they tell us is that it is the responsibility of the pilot in command to always make sure two things. One, that you are inspecting the aircraft prior to flight to make sure that it is in an airworthy condition. So the aircraft is in good condition, all of its components are functioning properly, et cetera, and also if at any point during the flight you have any reason to believe that the small unmanned aircraft is no longer airworthy. So you get some sort of warning message on the flight display, you notice some sort of abnormal flight behavior from the aircraft, and at that point it is your responsibility to terminate that flight and rectify the situation before you continue. All right, moving on. FAA regulation waivers. So as we mentioned a couple times when we went through the regulations, there are certain elements that can be waived, or basically that an applicant can request a waiver of to be able to do things outside of our standard Part 107 regulatory scope. Basically, if you request one of those waivers, it is an online process to do that. But you do have to submit a narrative as part of that process that gives a very detailed explanation of how you will meet what the FAA calls waiver safety guidelines. So for each waiver type, there's a list of safety guidelines that you have to show how you're going to fulfill all of those. You have to be very comprehensive in that, and if you show that to the FAA's satisfaction, then they will go ahead and issue you that waiver. Some waivers are going to be issued relatively quickly. Night flight, as we said, the waiver process and the common narrative that needs to be covered, relatively straightforward, and usually you'll receive that waiver in about 30 days. Others may take up to 90 days for approval. Some are even taking longer than that. Sometimes the 90 days is just what it takes for them to get to it and look at it. But if it's a complex waiver or a waiver that is really a bit more risky than some of the other types that are out there in terms of the actual operation that's going to be conducted, the FAA is going to spend more time, and there's going to be more waiver safety guidelines and harder waiver safety guidelines to meet. So it's going to take some due diligence to be able to meet their expectations satisfaction there. Also, it is definitely advisable to contact other agencies or companies that have received waivers that have been approved, and potentially they can assist you in developing or share with you some of the operational procedures that they incorporated in order to meet those waiver safety guidelines. So public safety agencies, they can talk to each other quite a bit, and that's usually very helpful in terms of preparing those public use COA requests that would include a lot of these waiverable things as well. For standard commercial operators, basically the FAA will they publish a list of companies that have been or individuals that have been granted waivers of different types, so you can review who those individuals are, and if you have the ability to reach out, not that everyone will share, but they might be able to give you some insight. Also, our companies like ourselves, we do provide consultation and assistance services with a lot of these waivers and authorization processes. Okay, moving on. So we wanted to give you a sense of what are some of the questions that you're going to see on this FAA knowledge test. And I'm not going to necessarily go through and spend the time breaking all this down. Really, we just want you to see the type of stuff that the FAA wants you to know about and why they want you to be able to answer these types of questions. So our first example here says, refer to Figure 69, Area 7. The airspace above Alice International is what? So we would have to look at this sectional chart. star, and we would find Alice International Airport there. And I can tell you that by looking at this, we would see some borders around Alice International. And one of the borders that I see there is it's a thick magenta border. It's kind of faded, and basically because Alice International is located inside of that border, I know that the answer to this question is actually C. It is Class G airspace from the surface, and in this case, up to 878 feet MSL. And we get the 878 feet MSL as a product of adding both the elevation of the airport above sea level, which is provided for us there next to Alice International as 178 feet, to a altitude reference that corresponds with that thick magenta border, which is 700 feet above ground level. Because we're in that area, we have uncontrolled airspace up to that 878 foot MSL mark. So our answer would be C. Looking at our next question, refer to figure 1. So this one's asking us for the definition of an angle. This would be some basic aeronautical information, and the letter A is in reference to the angle there between the chord line or the midline of an airfoil or the wing that we see, and also the oncoming relative wind or the air that's flowing over that airfoil. The definition of that angle is what we call the angle of attack. So there you go. Question number 3. This is an example of an aviation weather report. This is known as a METAR. This is the type of thing that we have to look at and decode to answer some of the questions on the test about current weather conditions. So this one says, refer to figure 12. Using the information provided, what is the current dew point at LAX? So LAX is the third METAR that's there for us, so the third line. And to tell dew point, we look for the fraction that's in that line. And if you go all the way to the end, we see the fraction 16 over 15. The current temperature is the first number, and then the dew point is the second number, or the denominator there. So the answer here is 15, and these are always given in degrees Celsius. So the answer here would be A, 15 degrees Celsius. All right, question 4. Refer to figure 20 in area 5. You have been hired to inspect the large tower with high-intensity lights located to the south of the glider port at Cotton Gin, which is a private airport. What is the maximum altitude you can fly while inspecting this tower? So if we look on there, we see Cotton Gin, and it says it's got high-intensity lights. So that's the tower, which is the little blue it's like a tall swooping upside-down V or echelon, basically, and at the top it's got little lightning bolts coming out of it. So that's the tower. The little lightning bolts are what signifies the high intensity lights, and to determine its altitude, that we're the top of that tower, we look at those numbers that are in blue just to the right of the icon. We see on the top there's a number 1049, and in parentheses underneath we have the number 1041. For our purposes, we want to use the number in parentheses because that tells us how high the tower is above ground level, so just the height of the tower itself. The 1049 gives you the height of the top of the tower above sea level, or an MSL altitude. So we know from our regulations that all things being equal and no other controlled airspace coming into play, we can fly up to 400 feet above the top of any structure, as long as we stay within a 400-foot radius of it. So if this tower is 1,041 feet tall, and we add on 400 feet to that, then we get the answer that's shown here as B. 1,441 feet AGL would be the maximum that we could fly under those Part 107 regulations in this case. All right, question 5. Refer to figure 22, area 3. You've been hired by a private pilot to video his airplane taxiing out to the runway at Shoshone County Airfield. Who must you contact for permission? So looking at Shoshone County, I can see that it is represented by a magenta airport icon. So the little circle there with the white line showing us the runway is magenta in color. That means that it is a non-towered airport, so there's no control tower there. The vast majority of non-towered airports, and I'm going to just take a stab at it and say probably about 95 to 98% of them potentially around the country. If it's non-towered, that means that the airspace from the ground up to at least 700 feet above the ground is going to be uncontrolled Class G airspace. So under Part 107 regulations with a remote pilot certificate, the question, who must we contact for permission? We do not have to contact anyone to be able to fly in uncontrolled Class G airspace. So as long as we were only going up to our normal 400-foot AGL maximum altitude in this case, even if it was a structure inspection and we had to go above that, we don't have any other surface areas of controlled airspace here. So the answer to the question is C. We do not have to contact anyone for permission. All right, moving on to question 6. Refer to figure 26, area 2. What is the length of the runway at Cooperstown Airfield? So this one is, I would say, a question that we've seen the FAA start to weed some of these out because there is no direct necessarily correlation for an unmanned aircraft flight based on this particular question. A lot of the questions, though, that still remain about the airport has to do with something along the lines of you are listening to the radio frequency that's used by pilots at this particular airport, and you hear an aircraft announce that they are in a certain position in the traffic pattern, and then they'll ask you, where would that aircraft be in relation to the airport, which is relevant because in those cases, when we're flying very close to airports, we need to make sure that we maintain our situational awareness. However, there are still some questions out there that are floating around that their direct relevance may not be quite there, and this would be an example of one. So to find the length of the longest runway, we look at the third line in the little text about the airport that's given for us there, and in the middle of it we see the number 35 or 35 listed. That is where we can tell what the length of the longest runway is, and it's provided for us in hundreds of feet. So the correct answer here would be A, 3,500 feet.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, so some of our study tips would just be, as Colin mentioned, really understanding the aviation terms and the sectional charts as well as weather. Those are huge sections, and a lot of our students do say that they are the hardest ones. So definitely having a good grasp on those helps. Also, utilizing practice tests could be very helpful as well. And another good tip is to not just memorize questions. They might word it in a different way, so that's always important. Also, understanding symbols and figures, and knowing which materials will be provided during during the FAA exam. So just a few quick tips. And then I also wanted to mention at DARTdrones, we actually offer both in-person and online Part 107 test prep. So we've trained over 8,000 drone pilots, and our students have a 99% pass rate on the Part 107 exam. Our flight instructors are also all manned and unmanned aircraft pilots and have over 11,000 hours of training experience. So the chart that you see here is just a quick overview of what students can expect during our in-person versus online Part 107 test prep. So a few that I just wanted to mention, we do offer 300 plus practice test questions, study guides, access to our chief pilot Colin for additional questions. We offer additional webinars, in-person instruction with an expert pilot, hands-on chart study, and a few others. So if anyone has specific questions to what you would see in our online versus in-person prep course, feel free to reach out to us through an email, call us. We would be happy to help anyone out. So for our Q&A session, we actually didn't receive any questions in the chat section. But if anyone does think of any questions, like I said, feel free to reach out to us and we're happy to help you out. I will be sending out an email with a recording of today's webinar as well as a copy of the slide deck. So even when you're reviewing that, if any questions come up, feel free to reach out. But other than that, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thanks, Colin, for providing all of your information, and we hope to see you all at a DARTdrones class in the future.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.